So it is really my pleasure to be moderating this session, and we are going to try to see what does it mean in practice. And let me turn straight away to Rolf Kuby, who is Director General at Euromines. You are at the forefront, in fact, of the implementation and these dimensions of critical raw materials from a European perspective. How do you see the strategic approach that has been taken by Europe translated into practice, and does it lead to new impulse and new initiatives? And what are the prospects that you have in mind for the way forward for Europe?
Yes, thank you. First, I want to congratulate the European Union to have issued the Critical Raw Materials Act, and also Nicolas Baer, who has been leading the discussions as a rapporteur in the European Parliament. So it's been a tremendous success, not only time-wise, how fast this legislation has been put in place, but also how balanced it is. I think it's a real balance between the environmental ambitions that we have and also the needs for raw materials as a whole, although the focus is on critical and strategic, but we all are aware that all of what is around us is built on the basis of supply of raw materials. Now, the Critical Raw Materials Act has many parts. I will highlight one part, which is the permitting, which is at the core of my KPIs as representing the mining industry in the EU and EFTA. That means we want to deliver fast. And I don't need to explain, because everybody is aware that geopolitical circumstances, but also the need to fasten our process of decarbonization is in need of commodities to build up all of the products and equipments that we need. So I'm very happy that this is going, and we expect at the latest by the 20th of March to have a list of strategic projects inside the EU, but also in third countries. So it's not a single process about what we want to do in Europe. We want to achieve this together with partners and friends throughout the world. I think this is a clear commitment to our joint ambition.
And you said, very surprisingly for anyone involved in mining, we know that this is a lengthy process, that you need to have discovery, then extraction, but you say the focus is on going fast. So how can we go fast in mining? Well, what is the trick that Europe can play there?
There are clear KPIs, 10% consumption from national or European sources in mining. That means by 2030. So that's a clear ambition. And next to it, it describes a permitting process that's supposed to provide a yes-no within 27 months. And we see already on the ground, for example, in Finland, streamlining of permitting authorities in the environmental fields, bringing them together from 7 entities, as I understood, to 1. So I think it's already materializing, it's already happening, because at the end of the day, it's not all about legislations, it's about how motivated are we throughout all of the entities that are involved to make it happen, because the EU only has a partial impact on at the end opening a mine or not, because at the end we need to take everybody on board, be it the local communities, be it the mayor, be it the regions, be it the member states. So we don't want to impose something on somebody from Brussels to Lapland or somewhere in Europe or in somewhere outside of Europe. I think it's a paradigm shift that everybody needs to embark, and as Nicola explained, it's getting even more urgent today, so we need to be fast.
And do we have enough mining companies in Europe? And have we not neglected too much the mining in the past, so to be able to shift the gear fast enough?
I think we have a lot of mining companies who are celebrating 100, 200 years of existence, which is also a proof of sustainability, because they have grown throughout the process. We have in Kiruna the biggest iron ore mine underground in the world. We have with KGHM in Poland one of the biggest ore bodies of silver in the world. And we have very prominent foreign direct investments from Australia, in Canada, in Europe, in Andalusia. So I think we have a lot that we can demonstrate, and we have also the excellence of the mining equipment suppliers in the world, with Sandvik, Epiroc, Metso. All of those companies are really there to prove that what we are doing is at the highest level of ESG and due diligence compliance.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Holly Ranay-Vozanani. You are the Deputy Executive Director of Africa-Europe Foundation, a critical institution also in trying to have these mutual partnerships between Europe and Africa that we're talking about. How do we ensure that this approach on critical raw materials that the EU is taking is not just too inward-looking, but is also beneficial for the partners?
No, thanks so very much, San. I think just a couple of things when we talk about Africa that we need to maybe take into account. I think first thing is there is a limited access to finance, and that goes beyond, I would say, the mere capital that is needed when we talk about this specific industry. What we see is that there is this very perception of high-risk investment when we talk about, of course, Africa. We've seen the weak infrastructure, we've seen the policy uncertainty, but on the raw materials in particular, I think there is still a very strong reliance on the artisanal mining, but as well small-scale mining. So having said that, putting a little bit, I think, in perspective what it means for greater partnerships, we see the structural issues that we need to address, in particular, what would be the role of EU to kind of look into these issues, how to work together, maybe in terms of the policy reforms, the de-risking mechanism that we've heard over the past couple of days when we talk about this, and the innovative financing models that we need to put into place, taking into account, of course, the challenges that we've seen as well, particularly within the African landscape. But if there are three things that I would like to highlight, I think, in this different approach with Africa, first one is the partnerships. We've heard over and over again, I think, the importance of working together. We need to look at reframing, I think, the partnerships to date. So how do we have a kind of a common understanding of a more effective partnerships, looking into account, and what you said, indeed, the need for the local communities to be greater involved in this. I think that's very important. How do we create an added value as well when we talk about jobs, skills, talent that will be on the ground, of course, and to have a more supportive local ecosystem, and that takes into account as well the local stakeholders, the homegrown tech innovations that we could also facilitate and encourage on the ground in Africa. Second point, and I think it's very important, it's actually looking at a larger share of revenues from Africa. So we've heard, of course, so far, Africa is very much seen as a raw minerals exporter. How do we shift a little bit as well this narrative and the proposals? We talked a lot about how do we look at moving it from the extraction, a pure extraction, to actually looking at processing, refining, manufacturing. We know the ecosystem needs to be put into place. There are a lot of challenges that we need to address, but also there are opportunities for having this kind of a greater added value that we could have, I think, on the ground. And that is, of course, looking at investing more as well within the human capital.
So concretely, then, what can the EU do to accompany this? Europe is interested in an extractive of critical raw materials, the provision of critical raw materials to the European market. So how can, what is required in addition to the extraction from Europe in order to be beneficial for the partner countries? And Europe claims to have a different approach than some of the other actors that are extracting and notably China, let's mention it, that is very present in Africa.
I think there are lots of opportunities to kind of reframe the partnership differently. First, in particular, is how to have actually greater incentives from European companies to come to Africa, to invest on the ground, and actually to work as well with the local industry and local players. I think that's very important, and you actually mentioned in terms of the expertise that we have here in Europe and with European companies. How do we make sure that that is about leveraging more that the knowledge transfer, capacity building that we could create and encourage more from European companies to go to Africa and build together that local ecosystems to make sure that, again, we move from that pure extractive kind of approach to really look at this local added value. So that's, I think, first thing that needs to happen. Second one, I think, to look at this structural approach that we need to happen as well here. We know that there's a lot of concerns, of course, in terms of the standard frameworks, policies, etc. That is something that we can work greater together with Europe. So looking at the expertise that has been built over the years, what it would mean as well for Africa. So important not to take Africa as one country. So I think the role of economic zones here is very important, and also to kind of integrate with what's already happening in terms of mechanism, the AFCFTA, regional integration, trade approaches, etc. Final point, I think we have a great opportunities here when we talk about resource diplomacy, and I think very much what Nicola has been mentioning. It's important to kind of elevate as well this conversation, paint probably a different approach in terms of the mining industry itself, and how do we leverage, for instance, the G20 presidency of South Africa to make sure that we have raw minerals as well as part of the conversation as a tool for economic development, for win-win partnerships for Africa and Europe.
Yes, and in a few days in South Africa, there is a big summit also taking place with the EU on clean trade investment partnership. I think that is also related to exactly to this question. Let me turn to Ian Claviter. You're the head of government and international relations at Anglo American. All this must sound extremely familiar, if not perhaps even old-fashioned to you. I mean, how to do extractive in a proper way, and what do you see is new, and what is the new impetus that is provided by the critical raw material initiatives in Europe, and how do you think it could best combine with this critical raw material diplomacy that Holly was talking about? What does it mean for you in practice?
Thanks, San, and thank you very much for inviting us and giving a company perspective here, which is something that is really, really key, because we've heard a lot about intergovernmental initiatives. Diplomacy typically is between governments, or the public sector in particular, although I was very happy to hear from Nicola's comments that it's also about bringing the finance community in, it's bringing civil society in. We also need the private sector in, because these partnerships that are agreed at a intergovernmental level or government-to-government level, that sets a framework, a skeleton, but the meat needs to be put on from the private sector, because the private sector are actually the ones who will do the projects, right? So that's just a quick one. Maybe Anglo American, we're a diversified mining company with a footprint mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, but looking to widen that footprint and diversify our footprint into Europe. And we have not only been doing this since the Critical Raw Materials Act. For example, in Finland, we've been exploring since 2004. We are doing exploration in a number of other European countries. But what the Critical Raw Materials Act has done, and that's to your question, it finally makes us part of a wider conversation, because previously nobody was talking about mining. Because it basically, the products were, the processes were outsourced, and the products were easily imported cheaply. It's sort of like the analogy is power coming from the socket, but you don't care, you don't really think about where it's produced and how it gets to you. So the really important piece for us is that this is the start of a conversation that we are now part of. And funnily, this being here in Luxembourg, from an EU perspective, if you think about it, this is recognition of kind of the foundations of the European Union, right? The European coal and steel community had its seat of its high authority. I walked past it last night when I was out for a walk. We're coming back to something that we have lost sight of, and it's not only mining; it's heavy, or the real industry in general. We have relied on the outside world for providing a lot of that for way too long. And we got a wake-up call through a combination of a pandemic and geopolitical tensions. But effectively, it's homemade to an extent, and we're now addressing that. And we as an industry are certainly very pleased about that realization.
Okay, but these are nice words, but I mean, in a sense, you were doing your business quite well and not necessarily in the limelight. Now you'll be more in the limelight. What do you expect from Europe, the fact that it has now a higher political attention? What concretely, how does that translate concretely into your business opportunities, and what do you see as different? Or could you be caught simply in the geopolitical tensions and might even make your life more complicated? So how to ensure that the fact it is more important for Europe, it translates also into new opportunities for you of doing things perhaps differently, better, in different ways?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, as I said, the CRMA is very welcome, but it's not going to change things within the snap of a finger, right? And that's also simply a fact of the industry taking a long time. I'll give you the example of Finland, where I said we've been doing exploration since 2004. We only just now concluded the exploration phase. That's 20 years, right? And we have now submitted our project up in Sakatti into the strategic project process that is part of the Critical Raw Materials Act, or one tool, so to speak.
And that will give you what, finance, political backing, or what are the concrete benefits of being a strategic project from the EU?
It's a really good question, and I think we are all about to find out, right? It's the first time around, but we know what the provisions are, right? Rolf was alluding to it, that it should give us a better plannability and planning ability in terms of the permitting process. In terms of what the Act stipulates, but it will need to be implemented at the member state level. As Rolf said, Finland has actually been very active in terms of starting to implement that. But Finland is only one country in the EU, and what we certainly see is that there is a shortage of expertise and experience because we haven't been undertaking many of these activities in many of the jurisdictions that we're looking at now. So, and rebuilding those skills is very important, and that is both for the private sector. If you look at the average age of our mining engineers is in the mid-50s. And it's not like that there is a huge pipeline coming after, because it was not the sexiest job to go into for a very long time. Even if you were studying engineering. I mean, there's a general engineering talent issue, and that's only on the private sector side. We also need the counterparts to actually process permitting applications, etc., on the public sector side. And because they haven't done it in a long time, there may be a lack of experience apart from the pure number of bodies in those regulators as well.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Let me turn to the finance here. Sylvain Eckert, you're a partner at InfraVia Capital Partners. Well, can you first tell us what is InfraVia Capital Partners and what you're doing in mining?
Sure, thank you very much, and thank to EIB for having us on the panel. So InfraVia is a private equity house that was founded 17 years ago, which historically has been active in the infrastructure space, but as of last year launched a critical metal strategy with a sizable investment from the French government, 500 million euros. So our purpose is to invest into the CRM, or critical metals value chain, extraction, refining, and recycling. But our objective and our purpose is to invest into those value chains for the benefits of the French and the European industries. But our objective is above all to deliver an adequate return to the investors that are giving us their money. And the reason why it's important and why we need to do so is that by doing so, we are mobilizing private capital to the sector. We're demonstrating that it is a sector worth investing in, and that will mobilize further and be transformational in terms of capital flowing into that sector. So we have strings attached. Obviously, an investment from the French government requires us to look at things with a certain perspective. I would point out, though, that in terms of governments, we are fully private, so we are not a government-backed fund. We are a fully private fund with an investment from the French government, and we are welcoming also other potential governments to invest into our fund to make it a more European fund, if that makes sense.
And do you see that there's a strong appetite because of these new dynamics at the European level on critical raw materials from private investors to join the capital and to invest in mining and mining processing?
So that's a very good question. As pointed out by my fellow panelists, the sector has not been one that has been favored by the investor historically, especially not the European investors. When we started to go and scout for investors in our fund to new LPs, we soon discovered that some of them had ban on the extraction industries overall. So with time and effort, we did manage to lift those bans for those exclusions for some of them. But it requires quite a bit of effort to educate the private sector to invest into this mining and metals industry.
I see. Rolf, you want to
Yes,
comment?
I want to seize the opportunity and congratulate Sylvain and France to be one of the first member states to initiate this kind of fund, which is, as I understand, $500 million from state equity and more than $500 million on private equities. And the same is happening in Germany, and the same is happening in Italy. So I want to congratulate that those are front runners in setting up financing in tandem with the EIB. But I also want to highlight and use the opportunity to be here the first time at this excellent forum to highlight that we have more issues than the CAPEX. We have lots of issues about the OPEX, and we have issues about the power purchasing agreement that needs to be de-risked to secure, because we don't need to open a mine if we cannot secure the OPEX. And also in the mid and long term, we need to look at exploration, because for each mine, and it was highlighted by Jan, we need 1,000 exploration projects to open one mine. So just the magnitude and how the financial world needs to understand the mining business much better. And we always say it's a long-term commitment working with the mines, but with a temporary impact. And I think it's now the time to act, but we need to look at the full picture. And also from the financial world, it's very important to get all of those projects started in the pipeline.
So, Sylvain, perhaps, just if you allow me, just to add to before you respond, is it the lack of appetite or expertise from the private financial sectors? Is that the reason why you needed to start it up to have some French investments? And are you financing the whole value chain and including the infrastructure related, or purely the extractive?
So we're looking at the whole value chain, but focused on the metals producers. That means extraction, refining, and processing. Standalone infrastructure is outside of the scope of our fund. It may be in the scope of our sister fund.
But do you have a connection between the two? Since in practice we know they are connected, is that possible to?
We're the same company, but they're separate funds, right? Yeah. So separate governance, etc. etc. But to answer to Rolf's questions, not to Rolf's comment, I fully agree with him, and I don't want to downplay the challenges that we're facing in terms of developing resilient value chains for the benefit of Europe, or resilient value chain in Europe. There's issues of coordinations, there's issues of how do you make sure that the midstream get feedstock from the upstream, how do you make sure that the upstreams get offtake from the midstream, etc., etc. On the bright side, I want to also to point out our strategy when it comes to analyzing those projects. So first and foremost, critical metals occurrences are not very rare. There's plenty of projects all over the planet. We got no issue sourcing ideas or project opportunities at the moment. A number of people are coming to us with their project. Our challenge is to be able to filter, to rank, to determine which are the good ones, which are the ones that will be company builders, which are the ones that will deliver low cost, long life, and resilient material for the midstream industry. So that's the first point. The second one is that we are not trying to, or we are not looking with a great interest at projects that are just trying to copy and paste what is done elsewhere. I mean, if you want to replicate a flow sheet that's been done elsewhere in an industrial park somewhere where sulfuric acid is pretty cheap, where power is readily available, you have a competitive disadvantage. However, there are a number of areas in Europe where innovation helps to make those projects more resilient and more competitive. And I'll point to a couple of concrete examples. I'll take the liberty of citing Calibre since Nicolas Baer referred to it, but many people will refer to that as the first conversion facility in Europe. Yes, that's fine, but it's a new process that's been developed by Metso, and that's not very well known, but they are actually doing pretty interesting innovation up there. The second thing, still in Finland, you got bioleaching pioneers that are operating a mine up there. And if you go to southern Spain, there are at least a couple of operations there that are on the verge of transforming and cracking the code of sulfide leaching. So these are the projects that are interesting and that we should be focusing on, not trying to go head-to-head with operations that are competitive elsewhere because they are intrinsically competitive, but try to build on our strengths. But again, not downplaying the challenge that we're facing in terms of energy cost, labor availability, or skills availability, etc., etc. But there are some more positive messages also to voice.
Yeah. Thanks, Jan. You wanted to intervene? You forgot.
I think Rolf actually, the very important point that Rolf made at the end is that of the understanding of the industry. And a lot of focus is being put on financing projects at a stage where they are investable, right, or considered investable. But you need that massive pipeline in order to get to a very small number of investable projects. And that's where policy support is actually required, and public funding can help to bridge or close that gap that we currently have. If you look at global exploration budgets and activity, that has decreased over the last few years, not only in the EU, but overall, because it was not a darling of the investment community for a very long time. And linked to that understanding, I think that is really important, is also the perception of people of what mining actually looks like. We're currently building a project in Yorkshire, in the UK, that is it's an organic fertilizer mine that sits under a national park, which is sort of the equivalent of a Natura protected area. It's fully permitted. You have no subsurface footprint. We will mine the product at I think about 1,000 meters below surface, and it will be transported via a 37-kilometer long tunnel to the port, right? In order to actually work within what is required environmentally and socially responsible. That costs a lot of money. Right? It's the biggest private sector infrastructure investment in the UK that nobody knows about at the moment. But it's those things where there is a perception which leads to a resistance or not a preference to actually invest in the sector. The other problem is, of course, the incentives for investors and the times don't exactly align with mining times, right? They look at 6 months or 3 months returns. We're talking about decades during which this happens, and we're talking about significant amounts of money, right? Like if you bring on stream now, if you build sort of an average tier 1 copper mine that produces about 300,000 tons of copper, that will cost you probably between 6 and 8 billion, right? And that is in money invested before you get not any profit, but any revenue, right? So it's actually a very long term, and it will probably take you 20 to 30 years until you get there from exploration.
So that's why you would need the EIB to have a long-term investor and able to invest massively, or
you need you need private capital, and that can be. I mean, it's not only going to be one investor. You invest in a consortium, right? Like, but you will need patient capital.
Yeah. Rolf and then Holly.
Yes, maybe one thing to add. So you need a business case and the understanding of the business case. I think Jan highlighted that, but only to emphasize again this question about exploration. So we need to get together with the investment world, and it's more than the EIB, I would say, but EIB could be a good facilitator for this dialogue, is how can we de-risk exploration? Because exploration is the start also of all of the mining. It's this where you go out, you meet the local communities, you go out. So we all have this ambition to do mining in a transparent, fair, and environmental sustainable way. So we need to look at the whole value chain and work on that. And that's maybe one of the takeaways I would say that we need to agree on here today, is that we need to look at that beyond the fact that all of what we talk about, the CapEx investments, be it in Calibre or somewhere else. Because many of my members are eager to come up with investable, bankable projects and are happy to find the support in CapEx. But at the same time, if you really have a business case, you can find private equity to it. So that's, but we need to look at the OPEX, we need to look at this long-term commitment on the exploration to de-risk this as soon as possible.
Yeah, no, just maybe coming back to what Sylvain, you mentioned, and looking at these bankable projects, and particularly from Africa, I think, as I mentioned, it's small scale and it's mostly artisanal. So what we could see, probably through a global gateway or any other EU instruments that we can think about, is a mechanism to kind of support, I think, this on-to-be bankable projects. So I think we need to put them to scale. So we need to accompany this kind of local infrastructure, local, let's say, companies or local industry players to make sure that they have the right ecosystem, frameworks, but as well, let's say, support system in place to accelerate and making sure they can go into to scale. So I think that's something even maybe for, fund like yours to kind of looking into and to accelerate this. I think that would make sense. And then the second one, just want to come back to what you mentioned, Jan, before in terms of this lack of talent shortage, etc. And I think this is exactly in the Africa partnerships, what we want to see in kind of a more inclusive development, to see Africa is today, I would say, the talent of tomorrow, looking at the youth population. So is there something that we could also explore in terms of capacity building, in terms of bringing, I would say, the works of tomorrow within that, of course, responsible mining sector, that we can work together with private sector, with institutions, etc. I think there's so much opportunities untapped today that we could explore and have a more inclusive approach moving forward. And talent is definitely one of them.
I think it's a very good point, and it is actually something that we have been doing for a very long time in the countries where we operate, so in Africa and Latin America, and that starts with STEM education at primary level, and it goes all the way up into both tertiary education, but also vocational education, because you do not only need mining engineers and geologists, you need welders, you need accountants, you need people who actually do all the work in the mining ecosystem as well, right? So it's absolutely something that we have been doing, and we can also learn, I think, when it comes to permitting and mining laws in Europe, from the countries that have been mining in the last few years, Chile, South Africa, right? Like actually they have pretty up-to-date mining legislation in their countries, which is not the case all over Europe at this point. So it's in general an absolutely valid point. And on the exploration point, I just wanted to make an analogy with another industry, because we had the health panel before. Everybody kind of accepts the fact that you have to do a lot of R&D in order to get to your product at the end. It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing.
But let me be a bit provocative. I mean, I still listening to you, I still wonder, Anglo-American and like don't really need a European policy to do their business. You know how to do your business, as you've been saying, you've been doing it for decades. And then isn't there a risk with the Critical Raw Material Act and the approach that, in fact, the mining industry and the financiers are focusing only in Europe, where you're already saying we do have some difficulties in Europe, and that's the priority, and we'll forget Africa and other regions which are more complex, where we need to change the regulations, where we need to start with basic skills development and so on. So isn't there a risk that the critical raw material approach by the EU will be purely European focus and will end up neglecting the rest of the world? So please react. Holly first, then Rolf, and then Jan and Silva to conclude. Holly, please.
You go first.
Okay, well, I was just saying that EU has already worked with Africa. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are a lot of partnerships on CRM with countries already in Namibia, Zambia, of course, DRC, or Lobito Corridor. I think what needs to happen now is have a more integrated approach and more a regional level approach as well. That's why I was mentioned about the role of the economic zones, for instance. I think that would be quite interesting to, and that is also helping to move it to scale. And I think it's important as well, probably from the African continent, in terms of the narrative that we see here, because we use the word critical minerals, but the question sometimes is critical for who, So what kind of minerals are we talking about as well? So I think there, again, looking at the frameworks, looking at the directions, the definitions, there's probably opportunities to increase that engagement, but we don't start from scratch with Europe, and I think that's important to flag, yeah.
And the Critical Raw Materials Act is only a part of the whole initiative. So if you look at, I think we are with 14 or 15 international raw materials partnerships that we have with DRC just recently. The last one, I think, the Ukraine one is one of the first ones, which is on hold, which is also hopefully going to be promising in the future after peace is coming. But there is much more. The whole unit, or the DG INPA, Kunduns, who is running throughout the world, if I'm allowed to say, and trying to find partners and partnerships. I think we are highly motivated in Europe to have partnerships on a transparent, free, fair basis. So I think there's a lot happening, much more than maybe we all see, and maybe not as fruitful immediately as we would want. But I think we will, at one point, have more concrete deals. Also with Africa, I think we have a completely new relation coming up with Africa now with the Commission and INPA. Yeah.
So, provocative question, provocative answer. It would be a nice problem to have if that was the case, what you were saying here, and almost, right? Because it would mean that we would immediately hit the ground and really get going. But even if that was the case, 10% of extractives, 25% of processing, and 40% of recycling, or is it the other way around? 40% processing and 25% of recycling. Flip that around, it means 90, 75, and 60, right? So the rest of the world will still be playing a very, very important role. And that's why we're talking about resource diplomacy and all that. To make that happen, though, these diplomacy efforts are really important, but also policy coherence is very important, right? We have the Critical Raw Materials Act targets, and as I said, a 10% target for within the EU means a 90% target for outside the EU. You also have to secure that. And that means you need to link your economic security policy with your development policy, and make sure that they are aligned. Also, you need to internally look at policy coherency in terms of you have a list of critical raw materials, but then some of them are actually hazardous, declared hazardous through other policies within the EU. So it's the final third point. The focus, and I think that's really important, Holly, what you said. It's not only about those critical materials, critical raw materials. They can change over time with technology changing. So everybody likes those materials now, and we need to be very careful not to be too focused specifically on the materials, but the underlying industrial process and the opportunities that it actually gives us in terms of development. Because if you look at a larger company like ours, a major diversified mining company, we may actually have some of these critical raw materials in our product mix as byproducts, but we don't specifically mine for them or process for them because the market for some of them is actually tiny, right? There are these salt and pepper materials that are very important and critical and strategic, but we have not traditionally mined for them because we mine for and process for, I don't know, copper or nickel or some others, but not the, I don't know, the galliums, germaniums, etc.
Thanks. Quickly, Rolf, before I turn to Sylvain.
Yes, just quickly saying that the trend is also because we need to decarbonize our society, our process, our industry. So that means that processing needs to come closer to the mines. This is a big opportunity for Africa to go and to access more of the value chain and the productivity in the whole process. So I think the asset that Africa has as a resource-rich country is that we need to decarbonize most of the processes.
Thanks. Sylvain, just let me ask you a couple of additional questions. I mean, because you're working both within the EU and internationally, so do you see a difference in the type of investors that are coming to you and perhaps also on their risk appetite or risk aversion? And the second question I have for you is, since you said you had initially also investment from the French government, would you be interested in having the EIB also coming and perhaps making your fund truly European?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the bigger the fund, the better, and the more its ability to move the needle, obviously. When you come to your first question about the investor sentiment in Europe and abroad, certainly there are some investors, notably in the US, who are more used to invest into the mining sector historically. The main difference that we see, and I should have mentioned that earlier, but we're a 25 years fund, so we're long-term patient capital, and that's where we can make a difference compared to other type of private equity strategies. The main difference in perception from the investors that we're talking to in Europe and internationally is the perception of that timing. I mean, it's difficult to get US investors or North American investors globally to buy into that. This is a sector that needs long-term and patient capital. If I may, I will just disagree a little bit with Rolf about the midstream processing. I agree with what he said about the industry needs to be decarbonized, and that in some instances it does make a lot of sense to install the midstream near the mine, because obviously the countries in which the material is extracted are also willing to bring more value add to the country. but from a pure engineer's response, my answer will be that you actually need to build the refining and or the processing and the refining where it makes more sense from an energy perspective, or where it makes more sense from a co-location with other utilities. So typically, you would build a smelter somewhere in Iceland where you get cheap hydropower rather than
that is the coherence Jan was talking about. I just wanted to...
No, there's a lot of sun for solar panels and energy in renewables in Africa too. So there's a lot to talk. I think there are opportunities left and right, and you are sure. Also, my membership is strongly represented in the Arctic, and so it's very, very, very much an opportunity.
I know it's the end of the morning and the end of the session. I just want to turn to the audience and trying to see. I see hands raising here. It's a bit difficult with the light just in front, but I see just there. We can take 2 or 3 questions. There's one here. You have a question as well? Sure, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is Rama Ayman. I'm with MMG Capital. We invest and we advise in and focused only in metals and mining space. One thing that has been touched upon, and thank you very much for organizing this exciting and very relevant panel. One thing that has been touched upon is regarding financing of these projects. As you know, the mining projects take a long time to come into production, and from the beginning to coming to production. And the big challenge is the early stage development of the mining, and that's where funding is less available. When the project is basically producing, raising financing is very easy. All the banks do it. And when it has a feasibility study, a lot of banks, including EBRD, would probably fund it as long as it's viable and meets all their criteria. The challenge is the earlier stage projects. And mining sector is kind of unique in that it's dominated by junior mining companies. A lot of them are cash poor. And I was wondering whether, especially with the multilaterals like EIB and EBRD, who are funding maybe very advanced projects that already have feasibility study, all the permitting, they already have all the offtake agreements. Well, everybody finances those. Are there pockets of funding that can be made available for these earlier stage projects? You mentioned Calibre. We were advisors to Calibre. It took them many, many years, like over 12 years to get funding. They could have come into production way earlier. And funding is actually one of the main obstacles towards projects coming into production, especially in this critical raw materials area where you need funding as well as offtake agreements and so on.
Thank you very much. There was a question in the back and then here. Yes.
This works? Okay. Hello, my name is Frank van Aschot. I'm the director of Counterbalance. We're a European CSO network. We work a lot on EIB. And I wanted to refer to something that was said in the introduction, that critical raw materials can make the difference between war and peace. And I was really wondering whether, like the EIB signed a MOU also with CRMs with Rwanda some time ago. And we all know about the conflict that is ongoing there. And the European Parliament actually voted a resolution a few weeks ago calling not only on the Commission for its MOU, but also on the EIB to look again at this partnership. We haven't seen any communication about this, and we know from the UN that a lot of these critical raw materials they come from Congo, where the rebel groups they illegally extract them and then sell them in Rwanda, which then exports them. And we also know from the MOU that the Commission made that Rwanda itself is responsible for the traceability of these minerals, so that's not very reassuring in the current context. So we are really wondering whether the EIB is going to take any steps to contribute to peace in its critical raw materials, especially with relation to Rwanda.
Our Master of Ceremony has a question.
I can use the mic on my face. Well, I don't mean to ask a question because I know perhaps it's not my place, but I cover a lot of space events, including Space Resources Week here in Luxembourg, and Luxembourg has a vested interest in this. And I'm just wondering, when we have so many conflicts in the world, why space mining has not been mentioned in this panel.
Space mining, this is a good one. I think there was a last question in the back. Was that correct? Yes? Sorry, just wait for the microphone, otherwise we cannot hear you.
Hello, yeah. I'm Andrea Pataki. I work for EIB Global. I just have a small question to Jan Klabiter, who seems to be having the most private sector experience with his company. I just have a question about economic and financial rate of returns for your company when you talk about these very long investments, and what would be the compensation for the investors? Thank you.
So a technical question to you, Jan. Not sure if you want to, or you want to keep that for bilateral discussions with the EIB, how you can do business?
That might be the easiest way, because, but I mean, you look at TSR that is all being looked at by various analysts. So it's not information that I have here at the tip of my fingers, but I'll very happily talk to you. I just have one comment back, maybe on the exploration point that was made by the gentleman over here. I couldn't agree more with what you stated. I can't speak for the EIB or anybody, obviously, but what I can say is that there are models out there, right? Like you have JOGMEC, for example, sitting under the Japanese METI. And they actually do go in at an early stage, and that is through public money to help early stage projects with funding and technical expertise also, right? And that is exploration work. So there are models out there, but I think, as I said earlier, here in Europe we're a bit at the we have a learning curve, right? With
Sylvain, you're the financiers. Can you do early stage, and would you need support from public funding to do more of the early stage?
I mean, we can't do very early stage. So typically, we would need a PFS or a BFS to start looking into a project. Progressing a project from PFS to BFS is a risk that is manageable as long as you have a proper business model and a proper resource assessment, etc., etc. But what I would point out is that historically the sector has been financing that early stage with the capital markets, especially in Canada and Australia. That has become less efficient in the recent past, obviously. So that's something that needs to be tackled at a broader level. But I agree, there's a financing gap here.
And can I just make one, because really, Rolf, can I just say one thing? One of the challenges with that structure is that you have, and it is the nature of the industry to an extent, that you have very small companies that need to promote their projects very, very strongly, which can lead to setting wrong expectations. Yeah. And that then leads to issues with communities and investors and everybody, because the nature is that a lot of these projects will not happen.
Materialize,
right?
And then you have disappointment.
And that then leaves the overall sector with a poor reputation.
Yeah.
I just wanted to repeat my request or pledge or proposal to sit together and to talk about what can we do to de-risk exploration, what can we do to start early enough to de-risk the pipeline and to get at the end more of those promising projects on track. So that's really something we can look together. And we know that pension funds invest in substantial ways in energy-intensive industries, in long-term projects, but we need to go beyond that. So we need much more, and we need to go more into the granularity that was expressed here also by the gentleman here.
Holly, a word perhaps also on the Rwanda and DRC?
Yeah, I'll just comment quickly,
yeah.
I think, on the this conversation around the financing. So, we just came back from the Financing Commons Summit, last week in Cape Town, and there was that very conversation indeed in terms of the responsible mining. And I think there is a greater understanding within the room, within PDBs, IFIs, MDBs, etc., that yes, we need to kind of work together into making sure that we provide that access or facilitate at least this access indeed for the more responsible and long-term financing here. And the point is probably to kind of a greater coordination as well with the strategy that we already have in Africa, which is the African Green Minerals Strategy. And how do we ensure that the financing, the funding, and particularly at the early stage is also included within that approach. And I think all in all, just to maybe cover some of the points mentioned before, on this responsible mining industry, I think it's important to have that dialogue. Dialogue open, indeed, of course, acknowledging what you mentioned, the ongoing conflicts, etc. But really working together, I think, with different institutions, with the member states and the government, with the African Union as well, with the other partners, to find, I think, the paths to make sure that, we work, we see the opportunities and potential, we see the risk as well that are associated with it, but this is about making sure we have the political support, buy-in, and working hand in hand with stakeholders on that front. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can see from this discussion that, you were mentioning, I think, Ian, the importance of coherence. Holly, you were talking about coordination. We talked also about early stage and the way, if we want to think about the future, we have to start at the very early stage financing exploration and not just the immediate extracting, and to try to take a more global approach. And I think we should really be reminded, both in Ukraine but also in Rwanda and DRC, about the strongly geopolitical dimension of CRM, and that if we want to be successful in a European approach, we need to be coherent within Europe and with a range of stakeholders, but also extremely coherent and in partnership with the partners, and to do it in a truly mutually beneficial way, which implies to also look beyond purely critical raw materials, but many other dimensions. So thank you very much. I think we can all applaud the panelists. Thank you very much for sharing your insights.